My interpretation of why the bill was put on hold is because the bill included support for studying language and culture, but there was no mention of immersing students in the language and culture. For me, this means there was no support for immersion schools. Since starting my PME in the summer of 2018, I have read a ton of articles around language revitalization, and all the scholars and research have proven that immersion school is how you revitalize a language. Once you start to learn a language, the culture naturally comes with it. When I was reading Bill C-33, I actually thought to myself, is the government afraid that Indigenous people will actually learn their language and culture, and that's why they have intentionally left out support for immersion schools? Fear. Maybe they're afraid the chiefs will talk about them in their Indigenous language and they won't know what they're saying. When I sit in the staff room at my school, we have immersion teachers who come in and sit down and they speak in Gayakono, and then they laugh. We do laugh a lot, so maybe that's what the government is afraid of. I know it sounds ridiculous, but maybe it's true. To me, leaving out immersion, support for immersion schools, is just absolutely ridiculous. The video in the Derek Nipinek article showed there are some First Nations that are not part of the Assembly of First Nations, or the AFN, Kahnawake being one of them. Clearly, the AFN did not consult Kahnawake or other reserves or First Nations who are not part of the AFN in creating Bill C-33, and therefore did not discuss how this bill would affect them. The age-old argument of control, which we talked about in the National Indian Brotherhood paper from 1972, seems to be what continues to halt any movement towards Indigenous control over Indigenous education. What Indigenous people deem control, the government says no way. What the government deems control, First Nations say absolutely not. In Bill C-33, there is a section labeled the Joint Council on Education Professionals. It's from sections 10 to 19. What caught my attention, and I had to go back and read it a couple times, was section 12. So section 12, appointment of members, states, the Governor in Council is to appoint 1 to 4 members on recommendations of the Minister and is to appoint 1 to 4 members from among persons nominated by any entity representing interests of First Nations that is prescribed by regulation. So section 12, part 2 addresses the chairperson. The Governor in Council is to appoint the chairperson on the recommendation of the Minister following consultation by the Minister with any entity representing the interests of First Nations that is prescribed by regulation. I feel that the entire section on the Joint Council clearly states that control will not be handed over to Indigenous communities. The Governor in Council will appoint 1 to 4 members recommended by the Minister of Indian and Northern Affairs Canada. I looked back to find a definition of Governor in Council, but I couldn't find one. Does anyone know what the Governor in Council is or means, and where do I find the definition in Bill C-33? Did anyone find it? I do agree with the criticisms, especially with what Chief White Duck said. First Nations did not sit with the Minister to draft the bill. Once again, some nations were underrepresented. The Minister fires back that any reasonable Canadian or First Nation will agree that you cannot sit with 625 chiefs to write a bill. My question to the Minister is, why not? You simply cannot lump all Indigenous people into one group and think one bill is going to satisfy us all. Though we are all First Nation, we are all individual nations. Sure, there are some similarities, but there are also differences. You cannot band-aid a solution. Imagine if you were one of these First Nations or reserves who got left out of the consultation. No one came to ask you how and what kind of help you needed, and then turn around and subject you to the same consequences or results as everyone else. What if you were the group that had it figured out? What if you were the Akwesasne Freedom School or the Kaliwanoho School? These schools seem to have culture-based education all figured out. But if you watch the video, in the Gully Wanoho video, you'll hear three ladies talking about how they cannot apply for government funding because they will not follow their curriculum. There's no English, there's no French, there's no history, etc. So they have to fundraise in order for their school to run. Finally, Sean Atleo resigned as the national chief of the AFN over this issue. There were allegations that he did not consult all First Nations throughout Turtle Island at the inception of this bill. If this is true, I do not know. What I can say is this is indeed a tangled web, but what you have to remember is the Government of Canada created this web when they decided residential schools were a good idea. It makes you wonder if they could do things differently. What would they do now?